So, interesting news to come out of the Senate. Ocasio-Cortez, she's in the House of Representatives, but a Green New Deal was put up by Mitch McConnell in the Senate, almost as a mockery of the Democratic Party, essentially saying, hey, you guys are interested in the Green New Deal? Fine, we'll put it up to a vote, and we'll see how many of you sign on board to this. Mitch McConnell looked at this as Democrats setting themselves on fire. Now, the Democratic Party itself, McConnell had this vote. No Democrats voted for it. Zero. Not one would sign their name onto it. Now, Republicans laughed at this and derided this and essentially kind of made this point that nobody would sign on to this woman's plan. You guys are holding her up as a symbol of the party itself. Ha 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 ha. Ha. Now, the Democratic Party in this looks at this and claims a certain victory. Now, part of the reason they're claiming a victory is because they're thinking we stood in solidarity and refused to vote on this bill. Meaning, everybody, for the most part, stood in solidarity and said, we're not going to participate in what amounts into a sham vote. You're not putting this vote up for seriousness. You're putting this vote up for this kind of political effect. And we're not going to participate in what's just political wrangling. So this is one of those yes and no things, where it's not necessarily as direct as each side is casting it in a particular way. And it's like, all right, which is true? Is it that the Republican Party essentially was able to expose that the Democratic Party in no way supported the Green New Deal, that the leadership of the party itself may be throwing these things out there, talking about how lefty they are, but when it comes down to brass tacks, when you get them on the record for a vote, the votes aren't there for it? Or is it that they were really just working in unison, that if people had a free vote, more of them will be interested in it? But in this particular case, they're not going to go under the guidelines that the Republican Party is set as a gotcha. Is it possible that it's a little bit of both? That Democrats don't want to pin themselves into this idea of a Green New Deal because they don't necessarily want to be attacked in the various districts that may be Republican-run districts, especially if the people aren't true believers, and not being true believers, not being able to defend against some of the attacks that are going to be leveled at them, that are going to be outright ridiculousness. So, in one respects, there is some reality to what the Republicans are saying, that the Democratic Party don't want to sign on the dotted line for this particular legislation. They don't want to play gotchas, meaning they don't want to divide the party. Having these fights of people trying to get other Democrats to sign on to the Green New Deal with other Democrats pushing back on the Green New Deal. They're trying to avoid this. They're working with a certain degree of solidarity and unison, and they don't necessarily want to be played into these political games. But there's a reality to that. I mean, there is something to be said for how many Democrats would have signed on to this if it was a free vote and if it was a real vote. And clearly the leadership is not on board for this. It was understood early on that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer was not on board for these ideas of Green New Deal. Even though, yeah, we can play within the lefty field all we want when we're out of power. The catch becomes, when you get in power, what do you do? In this particular case, Democrats stayed in unison, didn't vote for it. They looked at it as a sham election. The Republican Party walked away from this thinking they had some kind of victory because none of the Democrats voted for it, and they were able to shame the Democrats for one of their flagship policies. That's pretty much the basics of the story. I mean, of course, she's pushing for the Green New Deal, but they don't have the Senate. They don't have the presidency. And in this time period where they're trying to gather a certain degree of support and create a certain momentum for it, she's continuously making the argument to try to bring those people on board. I can understand the strategy of not wanting to participate in what amounts to something that's trying to peel off your numbers. So I can understand the argument that Democrats are making on this. Yeah, I guess to some degree it's right. I am curious, however, how many people would have actually signed on to that bill. I strongly suspect it would not have been many. I could be wrong, but I strongly suspect there weren't going to be many. This is also not just purely about splitting the Democratic Party. It's also going into 2020, not wanting to see how few Democrats would have voted. Because understand what would have taken place. You're going into a Democratic primary, and in that Democratic primary, it's trending hard to the left. Meaning one candidate after the next is trying to out Bernie Sanders in the primary. All of these candidates are speaking a different tune now that is decidedly further to the left, dramatically so, from what was in 2008 when Obama was running in the race. So, do you really want to have this kind of contest where the Green New Deal comes out and you're forcing some of the candidates in the race to put their name on this Green New Deal, which means they're tethered to it? And many of those candidates may be talking about this Green New Deal, but may not necessarily want to put their name on the list to get tethered to the Green New Deal. From the standpoint of the Democratic Party, if a few of them participate in it, then it's an open vote. And the people who don't vote for the Green New Deal, it is documented. It's documented. As opposed to everybody saying, we're abdicating the vote. We're not going to play this game. Well, yeah, we may not be playing this game because you don't want people to see how few Democrats are actually on board for the Green New Deal. Not only does that tarnish the party from the standpoint of the left, it also hurts your candidates, especially if those candidates are not really going to toe the Green New Deal thing, but put their name on the votes because they get tied down into it. I guess the question becomes, which one is it? I suspect it's probably the latter, if we're being honest. Yeah, I suspect it's probably the latter. If it was me, I don't want my candidates putting their names. I want them to be somewhat ambiguous on this stuff. So if they're talking about a Green New Deal, they could be somewhat shady on the Green New Deal. If you put your name down onto a vote, you're stuck. You've documented a case of you saying, yes, I am on board for this. And your candidate can be attacked for anything that's in that deal that may be this kind of wonky stuff that's difficult to explain. Your candidate could be attacked for it in the race itself. It's one thing for the candidates to say for a Green New Deal, but what they mean by that could vary from candidate to candidate. It's somewhat of an open question of what that means. But putting your name down in documentation in the bill, there are specific things within the bill itself. It's a difference in those things. I hope that makes sense. All right, I'm going to end this here. This was an interesting story. I thought it was it's politics. Interesting politics. And if they're looking at this is a thumping for Ocasio-Cortez, but again, it's not necessarily a thumping for Ocasio-Cortez in a sense where this is just purely political wrangling. That's why I'm bringing this story up. In case somebody stumbles onto this and was like, oh God, nobody's for the Green New Deal. This story is entirely political. There's no reality to this story at all. That's not true. There's a reality to the story, but the reality of the story is ensconced within the political aspect of it. It's like the reality is within the lie itself. It's odd. All right, guys. Thanks all.